Hey friends, I hope this finds you well, along with your loved ones. And thank you for joining me to meditate some more on Spinoza's ethics. For today, I want to address definition 8 on eternity, and I want to deal with give a sketch of Spinoza's philosophy of time, his 3 distinctions, which follow in accordance to one might call a kind of order, one most originary, one most derivative. So you have eternitas, or eternity, as the most originary, the most active. Then you have duratio, which is derivative in relation to eternity. And then you have time, which is derivative or parasitic upon duratio. And you get sort of increased as you go up, so to speak, or derive from one to the next. You get, maybe you might say, lesser activity. I think it will become clear what I mean by this metaphor, but I'm going to propose maybe a thought experiment about these distinctions. So if you think about the world and time specifically, you might think of laws of nature as eternal, not in the sense that they're fixed, static, but in the sense that they're always active, always enacted. Everything abides by the laws of motion, Newtonian mechanics, except that, of course, if you went into quantum mechanics, there are laws that pertain to how there's certain particles function even at the macroscopic or atomic level. If you get macroscopic, there are laws that pertain to that kind of phenomenon. If you get close to the speed of light, it's not as if you break the laws of physics. You sort of might engender or bring about a kind of different set of laws that are appropriate to that kind of phenomenon, which is why you have special and general relativity, and then you have respectively quantum mechanics for something like extremely small kind of atomic phenomena. The point being that those laws are always active, always pertaining to the phenomena, always being sort of brought about and again and again and again given, irrespective of the situation, so to speak. Like, they always pertain insofar as everything abides by nature, as it were. And so instead of thinking them as kind of static laws that just sit there, but as always being enacted, always bringing in about a causal force. Then you have duratio, which pertains to this or that thing, that pertains as to a kind of permanence or endurance. Something endures for this amount of time. A chemical reaction endures for this amount of time. But don't focus on the quantity. Think more in terms of duration as a kind of quality of a thing. A thing endures for, I find a rock on a beach, and that rock is pertaining to that beach. It endures there. It has a permanence there, right? But it's, you might say, less active in the case of laws. Laws are always pertaining to nature, the very fabric of reality, as it were. But the rock is not a part of the fabric of reality. It is a part of reality, but it's not a structure of reality. It's not always being enacted, always being sort of at the forefront causally. It's just a rock enduring, doing its thing, as it were, or a plant or a human being. Those things endure. They have a kind of permanence. Time, tempus, as opposed to duratio or as opposed to eternitas, time is numbered. In the case of the classic definition of Aristotle, time is that which is numbered with respect to before and after, so that requires a kind of conscious viewer that's saying 1, 2, 3, 4, and you might appropriate those units as seconds, so 5 seconds, as it were, or this video is 10 minutes. That's time. Time is allocated as a determinate kind of quantity. But for Spinoza, that allocation of time is a kind of imaginary activity. It doesn't pertain to the nature or essentiality of something. that is in a certain respect derivative. It's not active almost at all. It doesn't even capture the endurance or permanence of a thing. It just speaks more about a utility of ours to number things. I'll meet you for coffee at this or that time. But it doesn't speak to the essentiality of any given thing. It speaks more about a utility to maneuver in the world. In the case of eternity, those are the most fundamental. That's the structure of reality, the fabric and texture of reality, as it were. Permanence and endurance, that's just kind of secondary. And then this kind of third level, tempus or time, is even more derivative. It's just about utility, about maneuvering in the world in a particular set of seconds or time, a certain calendar, as it were. And so those three levels are appropriately describe the distinctions that Spinoza makes metaphysically. So these are not just like epistemological distinctions in time, these are metaphysical ones. Eternity pertains to substance, pertains to the infinite nature of, say, God or nature. That's eternity. Eternity is this active enactment of laws, so to speak, or of the very nature of what it means to be maybe a biological being or a physical being, right? They have kind of laws that constitute or are constituents or make the essence of that thing. Endurance pertains to the finite things. Finite things endure in this or that manner, but they don't necessarily exist. The laws of nature, those necessarily exist as structures and the fabric and texture of reality. And then time is almost the most derivative. It just speaks about our capacity to number things, to break things into parts, as it were, to sort of say this takes a minute or 60 minutes or 60 seconds, whatever have you. And that's derivative for Spinoza, at least. It doesn't speak to the essence of things. So I think with that in mind, we should read the definition, but then I will also sort of buttress our interpretation with a letter that Spinoza gives, letter 12. I think it's to Mayer, who is a radical Cartesian that Spinoza is conversing with at an early age in his life before even the publication of the Ethics. But it gives, I think, what the claims he makes there, Spinoza, are still relevant to the Ethics, and they give sort of that sort of extra information or extra sort of interpretation or vantage point to sort of see the insight that Spinoza is getting at with his definition. So reading the definition and the explanation of eternitas will be appropriate here. He says, by eternity, I understand existence itself, insofar as it is conceived to follow necessarily from the definition alone of the eternal thing. So one could think of like causa sui here. Causa sui entails itself. In conception, it exists necessarily. It could not be otherwise. It always effectuates itself, causally, as the laws of nature, as it were. They are, as he later puts it, naturing in its activity, and its dynamism, and its bringing about laws. Whereas in the case of something finite, that doesn't exist necessarily. A centaur could exist here or now. It doesn't have to exist forever, always. It doesn't, from the definition of a centaur alone, there's nothing entailing existence. Whereas in the case of causa sui, that's different. That's always pertaining, always being enacted, always true. It's, so to speak, the infinite at work, always pertaining to what is now, as it were, as to sort of the structure and fabric of reality. And then he gives an explanation, which is that for such existence, like the essence of a thing, the essentiality of a thing, is conceived as an eternal truth. And on that account cannot be explained by duration or time. And even if duration is conceived to be without beginning or end. So just as the universe there's no necessarily beginning or end, that still endures in a particular way. But the structure of the universe, the kind of laws that pertain and enact and bring about an order, as it were, those things are eternal. They're eternal truths. Spinoza really is a kind of naturalist in this respect. He is a positivist, as you might call it, regarding the laws of nature, that they are in fact real and they pertain to the very fabric of reality, and that they are eternal in that respect. Not in the sense of that they're static, because then one misses sight of this kind of activity that Spinoza wants to articulate. Whereas in the case of duratio, that's even less active than something eternal, and then time is like the least active, as it were. I think this will be corroborated by reading the letter 12, which has the kind of subtitle in the Naglach-Schriften, or the sort of Dutch publication of the letter on infinity. And also a side note, it's a correspondence letter. So in the if you're familiar with early modern studies, you would know that the correspondences weren't really private. They were sort of allocated to a variety of circles. So you would have like the Cartesian circle that would read all the letters by Descartes. And those were the most well-known things. Those were the things that you kind of experimented with your ideas, like a presentation before you published a book. Right? So think of correspondences as this initial stepstone for your publication about what you stand for when you actually write things and publish a book. So the correspondences were sort of, read by various figures. In this case, Leibniz had a copy, and I think the copy in the Curly translation is originally from the Leibniz's sort of library of owning, Spinoza's letter 12 specifically, and Leibniz is sort of inspired by this letter on the infinite, because the problem of the infinite is central in that letter, and in a certain respect, it has to do with eternity. It has to do with what is the most essential, as it were. So yeah, we should get to reading the letter, or parts of the letter that I will post up. So I'm going to read a preparatory paragraph because it will explain his inferences, the inference that he makes, the argument he makes about this distinction between specifically eternity and duration, and then we'll explain tempus, or time, a little bit later. So he says, I call the affections of substance modes. Modes, remember, to recall, are finite things. They're like thought things or extended things, plants, trees, thoughts, like 2 + 2 = 4. Those are finite modes. Those are modes of substance. They're finite. They're not essential. They don't stand on their own ground, as it were. Their definition of finite modes, insofar as it is not the very definition of substance, insofar as they don't stand on their own ground, cannot involve any existence. They don't necessarily entail existence. I could exist or not. This plant could exist or not. The trees behind me could exist or not. They don't necessarily pertain to existence. So even though they exist, we can conceive them as not existing. From this it follows that when we attend only to the essence of modes, and not to the order of the whole of nature, to the laws of nature, the essentiality of nature, we cannot infer from the fact that they exist now, that they will or will not exist later, or that they have or have it not existed earlier. From this, it is clear that we conceive the existence of substance to be entirely different from the existence of modes. Substance exists necessarily, out of necessity, out of its own definition. And here's the difference. The difference between eternity and duration arises from this distinction. For it is only of modes that we explain the existence by duration, but we explain the existence of substance by eternity, that is, the infinite enjoyment of existing, or in bad Latin, of being. And so in a certain respect, Spinoza is sort of unveiling his commitments to the fact that eternity has this almost quality of infinite enjoyment. So instead of thinking of the laws of nature as these kind of static things, think of it as kind of nature enjoying itself, nature expressing itself in its activity as a kind of affect. We think of affects as, happiness, joy, depression, etc. Think of nature as kind of reveling or enjoying in itself in its own activity of being. And eternity is precisely this most elated feeling, as it were, or affect of being. In that respect, it's a kind of activity. So that's why I want to dissuade from people, because people can read, people have accused them, history, scholars and other philosophers in the past have accused Spinoza as thinking of this very eternalist philosophy, wherein everything's static. Everything doesn't have a dynamism. Whereas in fact, if you really sort of read the details, no, in fact, infinity is the most active, is the most dynamic, is the most sort of, as he says, enjoying itself in its in being, as being a part of the fabric of reality. And think of laws of nature as this kind of activity, as nature naturing, as it were, and not nature as natured, in the sense of already acted upon, already derived, already dependent upon another thing, but rather as the source or wellspring of all that is, as a causal source. So now, if eternity is that activity, duratio is the kind of permanence or endurance of finite things, so that eternity pertains to substance and duratio pertains to finite things that endure in this or that manner. A rock that you find on the beach, as it were, or a tree that you walk around the house with, or walk around the house into, and you say, oh yeah, that thing was there, last night or whatever, right? There's not a definite time. You just recognize that a thing endures or has a kind of permanence, that it endures through time, or endures in duration is a better. I want to sort of abide by the distinctions because time has its own sort of derivation from duration, so that you have eternity, then you have duration, then you have something like tempus. And this paragraph will reveal that distinction. So next, from the fact that we conceive quantity abstracted from substance and separate duration from the way it flows from eternal things, we can determine them as we please. There arise time and measure, time to determine duration and measure to determine quantity, in such a way that, so far as possible, we imagine them easily. Again, from the fact that we separate affections of substance from substance itself and reduce them to classes, so that as far as possible we imagine them easily, arises number, by which to determine these affections of substance. So insofar as we separate things from nature, from their causal source, as ants or plants or trees or human beings, and we just treat them as they are entities unto themselves, we number them. We say, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. But we also allocate a kind of time to them. We say, this endures for 5 seconds or 10 seconds. This thing has been here for several years or several months, etc. So time is kind of parasitic on duration. Duration speaks to the indefinite endurance or permanence of finite things. And time is this kind of determination, this kind of fixation, and sort of imagination or numbering of things. It has to do with quantity, whereas in duration has to do quite more with a quality of existing, of finite things. And eternity is another kind of quality. It's not really a quantity. It's a quality of almost infinitude, of enactment, of enjoyment, of, as he says, joy, infinite joy, as it were. So I think that gives us a picture of the 3 different distinctions of time. We have eternity, we have duratio, and then we have tempus, or time. And those are all appropriate to his metaphysics. They're not just epistemological distinctions, but metaphysical distinctions about time. And this will sort of aid us, going forward, in part to sort of dissuade us from thinking of naively that Spinoza is just merely describing a kind of static structure, that eternity is just this static thing, like ideas in the heavens that have no activity and are just kind of waiting for material reality to fill it, as it were, rather than sort of this infinite enjoyment, infinite joy of just being at all. So yeah, hopefully that clarifies some of the distinctions from this definition, or definition 8. And I hope again that you all are well, and I look forward to the next video. See y'all.